The morning of April 27th, 1945, near the town of Grainau in Bavaria, a column of German women sat in the back of American army trucks, hands clasped in their laps, faces blank with the kind of stillness that comes from absolute terror. They were auxiliaries, Nachrichtenhelferinnen, communications helpers who had served with Wehrmacht signals units. Most were between 18 and 25 years old. They had been captured 3 days earlier as American forces of the 3rd Infantry Division swept through the mountain villages near Garmisch-Partenkirchen. Now they were being transported to a temporary holding facility, and every one of them believed they were going to die. They had been told what would happen. The instructions had been clear, repeated in training sessions and whispered in barracks across the collapsing Reich. If captured by the Soviets, expect immediate execution or worse. If captured by the Americans, expect the same, only with a brief delay. The propaganda had been specific. American soldiers were criminals recruited from prisons, degenerates who would assault German women before killing them. The images in newsreels and pamphlets showed bestial faces, hands reaching, violence barely contained. The message was unmistakable. Capture meant death, and death would not come quickly or cleanly. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The women in the trucks that morning carried this certainty in their bones. Some had destroyed personal documents before capture, burning letters and photographs that might implicate family members. Others had attempted suicide in the chaotic hours before American troops arrived, only to be stopped by comrades or found too late to complete the act. One woman, later identified in interrogation records as Hildegard M., a 22-year-old teleprinter operator from Würzburg, had swallowed a cyanide capsule issued to communications personnel. The capsule was a dud, poorly manufactured in the desperate final months of the war. She vomited for hours instead of dying. The trucks rumbled through alpine villages where white sheets hung from windows, the universal signal of surrender. The women saw German civilians standing in doorways, watching the American convoy pass. Some faces showed relief. Others showed nothing at all. The blank expression of people who had stopped trying to process what was happening around them. The war was ending. Everyone knew it. But knowing did not make the present moment less terrifying for those who had served the regime now collapsing. The convoy stopped at a former German military barracks on the outskirts of Garmisch. American military police directed the trucks through gates into a compound surrounded by barbed wire. The women were ordered out. They climbed down slowly, helping each other, and formed into lines as instructed. None spoke. Several were visibly shaking despite the mild spring weather. An American officer, a captain whose name appears in 3rd Infantry Division records as Howard Chen, walked along the line with an interpreter. He was asking questions, checking names against a list, sorting the prisoners by unit and function. The women answered in mechanical tones, voices flat. They gave rank, unit designation, and hometown as required by the Geneva Convention, though most doubted the Americans would honor any convention. They had been taught that international law was a fiction maintained by the Western powers for propaganda purposes, abandoned the moment it became inconvenient. Now they would learn whether that teaching was true. Now they would discover what the Americans actually did with captured German women who had served the Wehrmacht in auxiliary roles, who had operated the communications networks and administrative systems that had enabled Germany's war machine to function for 6 years. They believed they knew. They believed dawn would bring the end. They were wrong about almost everything. The women waiting in that compound were products of a massive mobilization effort that had transformed German society during the war. The Wehrmacht Auxiliary Service, the Wehrmacht-Helferin program, had been formalized in 1941 as Germany's manpower needs became acute. By 1945, approximately 450,000 women served in auxiliary roles across all branches of the German military. They were not soldiers in the legal sense. They did not carry weapons. They were not subject to military law in the same way as enlisted men. But they were essential to Germany's ability to continue fighting. The program had begun modestly. In the war's early years, women volunteered primarily for clerical positions, freeing men for combat duty. They typed orders, filed reports, and managed the administrative machinery of military bureaucracy. But, as casualties mounted and the war expanded across multiple fronts, the auxiliary roles expanded dramatically. Women became telegraph operators, managing communications networks that stretched from Norway to North Africa. They served as searchlight operators in air defense units, tracking Allied bombers in the night sky above German cities. They worked as cartographers, meteorologists, and telephone switchboard operators. Some became flakhelferinnen, anti-aircraft helpers who calculated firing solutions for heavy guns, though they were officially forbidden from actually firing the weapons. The Nachrichtenhelferinnen, communications helpers, formed the largest single category. By 1944, approximately 150,000 women served in signals units. They operated teleprinter machines that transmitted encrypted orders across the Wehrmacht's communication network. They manned telephone exchanges in command bunkers, connecting generals to field commanders. They maintained radio equipment and decoded messages using Enigma machines. Without them, the German military's command and control system would have collapsed years earlier than it did. The training was rigorous. Women selected for communications duties attended schools run by the Wehrmacht Signals Service. The course at the main training facility in Halle and der Saale lasted 12 weeks. Students learned Morse code until they could transcribe at 25 words per minute. They studied radio theory, telephone system maintenance, and military procedure. They memorized code books and security protocols. The curriculum emphasized speed, accuracy, and absolute discretion. Communications personnel handled classified material daily. Security violations meant court-martial, even for auxiliaries who were technically civilians. The legal status of these women was deliberately ambiguous. They wore uniforms, grey-blue for Luftwaffe auxiliaries, field grey for army, but without military rank, insignia. They received pay, approximately 80 Reichsmarks per month for junior auxiliaries, but it was classified as a stipend rather than military salary. They lived in barracks under military discipline, but were technically contracted civilian employees of the Wehrmacht. This ambiguity was intentional. Under international law, specifically the Geneva Convention of 1929, women serving in non-combatant roles were supposed to be treated as civilians if captured. The Wehrmacht wanted to maintain that fiction, while simultaneously extracting maximum labor value from female personnel. By early 1945, as Allied forces penetrated German territory from both east and west, the question of auxiliary status became urgent. Wehrmacht legal offices issued guidance to units in February 1945, instructing commanders on how auxiliaries should conduct themselves if capture became likely. The guidance was remarkably specific. Auxiliaries were to destroy all classified documents. They were to remove any insignia that might identify their specific unit or function. They were to carry their Soldbuch, their military paybook, which would prove their auxiliary status and theoretically guarantee protection under international law. The guidance said nothing about what would actually happen to them. It could not, because no one in the Wehrmacht High Command knew. German intelligence on Allied prisoner-of-war policies was fragmentary and contradictory. Some reports suggested the Americans treated prisoners according to Geneva Convention standards. Other reports, amplified by Goebbels' propaganda ministry, painted a different picture entirely. The women in that compound had been shaped by propaganda that grew more extreme as Germany's military situation deteriorated. The message had evolved over the war's course, adapting to changing circumstances, but always emphasizing the same core themes. The Allies were barbaric, defeat meant annihilation, and survival depended on continued resistance regardless of cost. In the war's early years, propaganda about the Western Allies had been relatively restrained. Newsreels and radio broadcasts portrayed British and American forces as militarily incompetent, hampered by democratic politics and racial mixing. The tone was contemptuous rather than apocalyptic. Germany was winning, the propaganda explained, Because National Socialism produced superior soldiers and society. The Allies were decadent, already defeated, merely too stubborn or stupid to recognize reality. This changed after Stalingrad. The catastrophic defeat in February 1943, where the entire German Sixth Army was destroyed, forced a fundamental shift in propaganda strategy. Joseph Goebbels, Reich Minister of Propaganda, delivered his infamous Total War speech on February 18, 1943, at the Berlin Sportpalast. The speech marked a turning point. No longer could propaganda rely on promises of easy victory. Instead, it emphasized existential threat. Germany faced enemies bent on total annihilation. Defeat meant the end of German civilization. Every citizen had to contribute to the war effort or bear responsibility for the destruction that would follow. The propaganda directed at women intensified accordingly. Posters showed German women and children threatened by monstrous figures representing Soviet soldiers. The images were deliberately graphic, designed to provoke visceral fear. Radio broadcasts featured testimonies from refugees fleeing the Eastern Front, describing Soviet atrocities in explicit detail. Some of these accounts were genuine, documenting real horrors committed during the Red Army's advance into East Prussia. Others were fabricated or exaggerated by propaganda offices. The line between truth and manipulation became impossible to distinguish. For women serving in auxiliary roles, the propaganda carried specific warnings. Wehrmacht orientation sessions included lectures on the fate awaiting female prisoners. The instructors, usually older officers or political officers from the National Socialist Leadership Office, described Allied treatment of captured German women in terms calculated to produce maximum fear. Soviet captivity meant rape and execution, they explained, often in that order. American and British captivity meant the same, only slower. The Western Allies would use captured German women for forced labor, propaganda purposes, and sexual exploitation before eventual disposal. These warnings were accompanied by standing orders that essentially encouraged suicide rather than capture. While never stated explicitly in official documents, the implication was clear in verbal instructions given to auxiliary units. Women were issued cyanide capsules, ostensibly for use if torture became imminent. The capsules were presented as a final option, a way to maintain dignity and protect secrets. But the subtext was unmistakable. Capture was a fate worse than death, and death should be chosen when capture became inevitable. The efficacy of this propaganda cannot be overstated. It penetrated completely, creating a psychological framework that shaped every auxiliary's understanding of what awaited them if German lines collapsed. When American forces broke through in Bavaria in April 1945, many auxiliary units destroyed their equipment and fled into the mountains rather than surrender. Those who were captured did so only when flight became physically impossible, when American troops surrounded their positions and ordered them out at gunpoint. The women in the Garmisch compound that April morning carried this propaganda-constructed reality in their minds. They had heard the warnings hundreds of times. They had seen the posters and newsreels. They had attended the lectures and received the capsules. Every message had been consistent. The Americans would show no mercy. International law was a fiction. The Geneva Convention would be ignored. Female prisoners could expect treatment identical to what refugees reported from the Eastern Front, rape and murder conducted with bureaucratic efficiency by an enemy bent on German annihilation. This belief was total. It admitted no doubt, and it was about to collide with a reality that would shatter every assumption these women held about their captors, about the war, and about the regime they had served. The American military had established procedures for handling prisoners of war that were methodical, bureaucratic, and fundamentally shaped by a principle the German women could not have anticipated: adherence to international law as a matter of policy rather than propaganda. The system that would process the women from Grainau had been developed over years of combat operations, refined through experience in North Africa, Italy, and now Germany itself. It was designed to extract intelligence, prevent security breaches, and maintain order among captured enemy personnel while complying with Geneva Convention requirements. The 3rd Infantry Division had captured approximately 12,000 German prisoners in the final weeks of April 1945 as it advanced through Bavaria. The logistical challenge was immense. Each prisoner required documentation, medical screening, interrogation, and eventual transfer to permanent facilities. The division's military government detachment, working with military police companies and counterintelligence corps personnel, had established a processing system that could handle hundreds of prisoners daily. Female prisoners presented specific complications. The Geneva Convention required that women be housed separately from male prisoners, with female guards when available. They were to receive medical care appropriate to their needs. They were entitled to the same rations and living conditions as equivalent rank American personnel. These requirements were not theoretical. 3rd Army, headquarters, commanded by General George Patton, had issued explicit orders in March 1945 regarding treatment of female prisoners. The orders emphasized strict compliance with international law, partly from genuine commitment to legal standards, partly from practical recognition that mistreatment would provide Germany with propaganda material. The American military in Europe operated under the assumption that everything they did would eventually become public. Journalists accompanied combat units. The Red Cross inspected POW facilities. Letters from prisoners reached families through international channels. This transparency was intentional, part of a broader American strategy to demonstrate moral superiority over Nazi Germany. Where German propaganda claimed the Allies were barbaric, American policy aimed to prove otherwise through systematic adherence to civilized standards of warfare. When the trucks arrived at the Garmisch facility, the women were directed to a processing area that had been a German military warehouse. Tables were arranged in rows, each staffed by an American soldier with forms, a typewriter, and an interpreter. The process was familiar to anyone who had dealt with American military bureaucracy. Name, rank, serial number if applicable, date of birth, place of birth, unit assignment, specialization. The information went onto cards that would follow each prisoner through the system. A medical officer, Captain Robert Steinberg, according to 3rd Infantry Division records, conducted cursory health screenings. He checked for obvious wounds, signs of disease, and evidence of malnutrition. The women were given the same examination male prisoners received. Check teeth, check eyes, check for lice, check for injuries requiring immediate treatment. Steinberg noted in his medical log that the female auxiliaries appeared generally healthy despite the chaos of the preceding weeks. Most were underweight by American standards, but not dangerously so. Several had minor injuries from the retreat through the mountains. One had a broken arm poorly set, requiring re-braking and proper casting. The interrogations followed. Counter-intelligence corps personnel, trained specifically to extract information from prisoners, conducted interviews in a former German officer's mess that had been converted into an interrogation center. The room was unremarkable. Tables, chairs, a single window with sunlight streaming through. No instruments of torture, no cells, just chairs and a translator. The questions were specific and technical. What unit were you assigned to? What communications equipment did you operate? What frequencies were used? What codes and ciphers? Where were command posts located? The interrogators were professionals, trained at Fort Hunt in Virginia before deployment to Europe. They knew which questions mattered and how to identify evasion. But their methods bore no resemblance to what the women expected. There was no violence, no threats. The interrogators were firm, but correct, maintaining professional distance. When a woman refused to answer beyond name and unit, which was her right under Geneva Convention Article 17, the interrogator noted the refusal and moved to the next question. When a woman broke down crying, overwhelmed by stress and fear, the interrogation paused. The translator, usually a German-American soldier or a German refugee who had fled the Nazis years earlier, would speak quietly, offering water, waiting for composure to return. This treatment produced cognitive dissonance so severe that some women initially suspected it was a sophisticated form of psychological torture. They had been taught that Americans were cruel, that prisoners were abused and discarded, But the reality unfolding around them contradicted every warning. The interrogators were methodical, even boring in their bureaucratic thoroughness. They filled out forms in triplicate. They checked boxes. They asked the same questions multiple times to verify consistency. It was administrative processing, not the prelude to execution. The shift began not with any single dramatic event, but with the accumulation of details that refused to align with propaganda-constructed expectations. It started with food. On the evening of April 27th, after processing was complete, the women were directed to a mess facility in one of the barracks buildings. They entered expecting starvation rations, the thin soup and mouldy bread that characterized Germany's own POW camps in the war's final months. What they received instead was standard American military fare prepared for prisoner consumption, according to Geneva Convention standards. The meal that evening, documented in 3rd Infantry Division quartermaster records, consisted of white bread, margarine, canned meat, boiled potatoes, carrots, and coffee. Real coffee, not the ersatz substitutes made from acorns and barley that had been standard in Germany since 1942. The portions were substantial by German standards, calibrated to provide approximately 2,500 calories per person per day, the minimum required by Geneva Convention Article 11 for prisoner rations. The women stared at the food with incomprehension. Several refused to eat initially, suspecting poison. Hildegard M., the teleprinter operator who had survived her defective cyanide capsule, later told American interrogators that she watched an American soldier eat from the same pot of stew before she would touch her portion. Only when it became clear the food was genuine and unspoiled did the women begin eating, slowly at first, then with the desperate hunger of people who had been on reduced rations for months. The coffee was particularly significant. By late 1944, real coffee had disappeared from German civilian life entirely, rationed away and then eliminated from distribution. Even Wehrmacht personnel received coffee. Substitutes except in forward combat units. The presence of real coffee in a prisoner facility, distributed freely to enemy personnel, represented a level of material abundance that contradicted fundamental assumptions about American capacity and intentions. One woman, identified in interrogation reports only as Maria K., a 20-year-old radio operator from Stuttgart, asked the German-speaking American guard why they were being fed so well before execution. The guard, a corporal whose family had emigrated from Germany in 1936, looked genuinely confused by the question. There would be no execution, he explained. They were prisoners of war. They would be held according to international law until hostilities ceased, then repatriated. The answer was so matter-of-fact, so bureaucratically casual, that Maria K. initially thought she had misunderstood his German. The barracks where the women were housed that night provided further evidence of systematic contradiction. The building had been a German military facility, recently vacated by Wehrmacht personnel who had either fled or been captured. The Americans had done minimal cleaning, removed obvious military equipment, and installed additional bunks to accommodate the female prisoners. The facilities were basic but adequate: bunks with mattresses, blankets, a functioning toilet and washroom, windows that could be opened for ventilation. More importantly, there were no guards inside the barracks. American military police patrolled outside, ensuring no one escaped the compound, but the women were left to themselves inside the building. This was standard American practice, based on the principle that prisoners who were adequately fed, housed, and treated according to law had minimal incentive to create problems. But for women who had been taught that capture meant immediate brutalization, the absence of guards in their sleeping quarters was incomprehensible. The second morning brought another collision between expectation and reality. Breakfast was bread, margarine, jam, and more coffee. After the meal, the women were assembled in the compound yard. An American officer, speaking through an interpreter, explained the daily schedule. There would be a morning roll call. Prisoners would be assigned work details, light cleaning, and maintenance duties around the compound. Medical sick call would be available at designated hours. Letters to family could be written and would be forwarded through International Red Cross channels. though delivery was not guaranteed given Germany's collapsed postal system. The announcement about letters produced visible shock. Under Geneva Convention Article 42, prisoners were entitled to send correspondence. The American military took this requirement seriously, maintaining bureaucratic systems to process prisoner mail, even as combat operations continued. For the German women, the idea that they would be allowed to contact family, to inform parents, and siblings that they were alive and unharmed had never occurred to them. It contradicted everything they believed about American intentions. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. That afternoon, a delegation from the International Committee of the Red Cross arrived to inspect the facility. The visit was routine, part of the Red Cross's systematic inspection of POW facilities throughout the European theatre. The delegates, Swiss nationals operating under international mandate, interviewed prisoners privately, asking about treatment, living conditions, and any complaints. The women struggled to articulate their experience. They had complaints, certainly the uncertainty, the fear, the disruption of their lives. But when asked specifically if they had been mistreated, beaten, or denied food or medical care, they could only answer no. The Red Cross inspection was documented in a report filed with ICRC headquarters in Geneva. The report, archived and publicly available, notes that female German prisoners at the Garmisch facility were being held in accordance with Geneva Convention standards. Living conditions were adequate, rations met minimum requirements, no evidence of abuse or mistreatment was observed. The report was bureaucratic, almost boring in its procedural thoroughness. It described a functional system operating according to international law, precisely what the women had been taught would never happen. The realization came gradually for most, sudden and devastating for some. They had been lied to. The propaganda that had shaped their understanding of the war, of the enemy, of their own choices, had been fundamentally false. This recognition produced psychological effects that American interrogators documented with clinical precision in their reports. Some women experienced what would later be recognized as symptoms of acute stress response, difficulty sleeping, intrusive thoughts, emotional numbness alternating with periods of intense emotion. The terror they had felt during capture and the first days of imprisonment had been based on certain knowledge of what would happen. When that certainty proved false, it created cognitive and emotional whiplash that manifested in various ways. Hildegard M., in her interrogation sessions, began asking detailed questions about American treatment of prisoners. She wanted to know if the conditions at Garmisch were typical or exceptional. Were male prisoners fed the same rations? Were they also allowed to send letters? The interrogator, a counterintelligence corps officer named Lieutenant James Morrison, answered factually. Yes, all prisoners received equivalent treatment according to rank and status. The Geneva Convention required it. American policy mandated it. The treatment she was experiencing was not special consideration for women, but standard procedure for all prisoners. This answer triggered a breakdown. Hildegard wept for nearly 20 minutes, unable to articulate what she was feeling. Later, when she had composed herself, she explained through the interpreter that she had attempted suicide before capture because she believed death was preferable to what the Americans would do to her. She had been certain, absolutely certain, that capture meant rape and execution. The propaganda had been clear. The officers had been explicit. Everyone knew what happened to German women captured by the enemy. Now she understood that she had nearly killed herself to avoid something that was never going to happen. The Americans had no intention of executing her. They were feeding her better than the Wehrmacht had fed its own personnel in the final months. They were treating her according to international law that she had been taught was a meaningless fiction. Everything she had believed, everything she had been taught about the enemy, was wrong. Other women expressed the realization differently. Maria K., the radio operator from Stuttgart, became angry. In her interrogation sessions, she began asking why. Why had they been told Americans would kill them? Why had the propaganda depicted Allied soldiers as criminals and monsters? Why had officers issued cyanide capsules if capture meant nothing worse than imprisonment with adequate food and medical care? The interrogators had no satisfying answers to these questions. They could explain American policy and procedures. They could cite the Geneva Convention and international law. But they could not explain why German propaganda had been so extreme, why the Nazi regime had chosen to terrify its own personnel with false descriptions of Allied brutality. The most they could offer was speculation, perhaps to encourage resistance, perhaps to prevent surrenders, perhaps because a regime built on lies could not stop lying even to its own people. The material evidence of American abundance compounded the psychological shock. Women who had operated Wehrmacht communications networks understood military logistics at a technical level. They knew what it took to keep an army supplied, to maintain equipment, to sustain operations across vast distances. The casual plenty they observed in the American compound revealed a level of industrial capacity that made Germany's war effort look pitiful by comparison. The coffee was emblematic. Real coffee, distributed to prisoners daily, meant American logistics could transport luxury items across an ocean and a continent to a temporary holding facility for enemy personnel. The white bread meant American supply lines could deliver fresh-baked goods to frontline areas. The medical care meant American forces had sufficient doctors, equipment, and supplies to treat enemy wounded to the same standard as their own troops. One woman, a Luftwaffe auxiliary named Goethe S., who had served as a searchlight operator in air defense units, expressed it most clearly. In an interrogation session documented by Lieutenant Morrison, she explained that she had watched Allied bomber formations for 2 years, tracking aircraft that came in formations of hundreds, escorted by fighters, attacking German cities with a weight of explosives that seemed impossible to sustain. She had believed German propaganda that claimed these were desperate efforts, that America was exhausting itself, that the bomber offensive would collapse from unsustainable losses. Now, captured and fed and treated according to law by an enemy she had been taught to fear, she understood that the bombing campaign had been a fraction of American capacity. If they could afford to feed prisoners real coffee and white bread while simultaneously sustaining massive air operations and ground offensives across multiple continents, then Germany had been fighting an enemy with resources so vast that defeat had been inevitable from the beginning. This realization was devastating because it meant everything had been pointless. The sacrifices, the hardships, the years of service, all of it had been in service of a cause that could not possibly win. The regime had known this, or should have known it, yet had continued fighting anyway, consuming its own people in a war that mathematics and industrial capacity had already decided. The women remained at the Garmisch facility for 11 days before transfer to a larger prisoner of war camp at Augsburg. During those 11 days, the psychological processing continued in conversations among themselves, in interrogation sessions with American intelligence officers, and in the private reckoning each woman conducted with what she had believed versus what she now knew to be true. The discussions in the barracks at night revealed a pattern. Women who had been most deeply committed to National Socialist ideology struggled most severely with the cognitive dissonance. Those who had joined the auxiliary service out of ideological conviction, who had believed in the regime's propaganda about racial destiny and civilizational struggle, found no framework to process the reality of American treatment. Their worldview had been constructed on the premise that this was an existential war between incompatible civilizations, that the enemy represented barbarism against which German culture stood as the last defense. American adherence to international law, bureaucratic correctness, and material abundance undermined the entire ideological structure. Other women, those who had joined for practical reasons, employment, food security, escape from difficult family situations, adapted more quickly. They had never fully internalized the propaganda. They had served because the regime demanded service and offered compensation. The discovery that American captivity meant regular meals and safety rather than death was unwelcome in that it meant imprisonment, but it was not psychologically shattering. They could accept that they had been lied to because they had never entirely believed the lies in the first place. The interrogators documented this division. Lieutenant Morrison's reports, filed with Third Army Intelligence Headquarters, noted that ideological commitment correlated inversely with psychological resilience among female prisoners. The true believers were having breakdowns. The pragmatists were adapting. The pattern was consistent enough that counterintelligence corps analysts began using degree of ideological commitment as a predictor of which prisoners would provide useful intelligence. Those experiencing psychological crisis from shattered beliefs were more likely to talk, to seek some way to make sense of what had happened by contributing to the American intelligence effort. The transfer to Augsburg on May 8, 1945, coincided with Germany's unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was over. The women learned this from American guards who were openly celebrating, singing, drinking, beer that had appeared from somewhere in the supply chain. The guards' joy was complicated by knowledge that many had been slated for redeployment to the Pacific, where the war against Japan continued. But for the moment, in Europe, it was over. For the German women, the end came not as relief, but as confirmation of what they had already begun to understand. Germany had lost. The regime had collapsed. Everything they had worked for, every sacrifice the propaganda had demanded, had ended in total defeat. The life they had known, the society that had shaped them, the future they had been promised, all of it was gone, replaced by military occupation and an uncertain future as prisoners of a war that had consumed everything. The Augsburg camp was a former Wehrmacht barracks complex, now administered by the United States Army as a prisoner of war facility, housing approximately 8,000 German prisoners, military and civilian. The female auxiliaries were housed in a separate section, guarded by Women's Army Corps personnel when available, by military police when WWII soldiers were not. The routine was established and bureaucratic. Roll call, work details, meals, medical care, occasional interrogations, and waiting. The waiting was perhaps the hardest part. The women were told they would be held until denazification screening could be completed, until intelligence officers determined whether they had been involved in war crimes or significant Nazi Party activities, until transportation could be arranged for repatriation to home areas now under Allied occupation. The process took months. Some women remained in prisoner of war status until early 1946, before being released to return to homes that often no longer existed, to families scattered or dead, to a country that had been divided into occupation zones and would remain divided for the next 4 decades. During those months of waiting, the full scope of what the regime had done became unavoidable. Allied authorities required German prisoners to watch documentary films of concentration camp liberations. The footage from Bergen-Belsen, from Dachau, from Buchenwald, showed conditions that most auxiliary personnel claimed not to have known about. The films were graphic, deliberately so, designed to confront Germans with evidence of atrocities committed in their name. The reaction among the women at Augsburg varied. Some refused to believe the footage was genuine, claiming it was propaganda, fake images created to justify Allied occupation. Others accepted it as true, but maintained they had known nothing, that they had served in communications roles far from the camps, that the regime had kept such things secret. A few acknowledged that they had heard rumors, had seen things that suggested something terrible was happening, but had chosen not to investigate or question because doing so was dangerous, and they had convinced themselves it was not their responsibility. The denazification process, conducted by American military government officials beginning in summer 1945, attempted to categorize every German according to degree of responsibility for Nazi crimes. The system divided people into 5 categories: major offenders, lesser offenders, followers, and persons exonerated. Female auxiliaries generally fell into categories 3 or 4, lesser offenders or followers, unless specific evidence linked them to war crimes or significant party activities. For most of the women captured at Grainau, the process resulted in classification as followers. They had served the Wehrmacht in technical roles. They had enabled the military's communications systems. But they had not committed specific criminal acts, had not held party positions of significance, had not participated in atrocities. Under the denazification framework, They were guilty of supporting the regime, but not criminally responsible for its worst acts. This distinction felt meaningless to many of the women themselves. They had contributed to the war effort. They had kept the communications networks functioning that had enabled Wehrmacht operations across Europe. The messages they had transmitted, the orders they had relayed, had resulted in deaths. The fact that they had not personally killed anyone, that they had operated teleprinters and radios rather than weapons, did not change the reality that their work had been essential to Germany's ability to wage war. Hildegard M., in interviews conducted decades later by historians researching women's roles in the Wehrmacht, expressed this clearly. She had been a teleprinter operator. She had transmitted orders for troop movements, supply requisitions, tactical instructions. Some of those orders had certainly resulted in combat operations where people died. She had known this at the time but had not allowed herself to think about it, because thinking about it would have made her work unbearable. Now, looking back from the perspective of decades, she acknowledged that she bore responsibility, not criminal responsibility perhaps, but moral responsibility for having served a regime conducting a war of aggression and genocide. Other women took different views. Some maintained they had been young, had been drafted or pressured into service, had done what was required to survive. They rejected any attribution of moral responsibility, arguing that they had been victims themselves, caught in circumstances beyond their control. These women tended to describe their wartime service in purely technical terms, as a job they had performed under duress, no different from factory work or farm labour. The historical record suggests both perspectives contain truth. Women who served as Wehrmacht auxiliaries ranged from committed ideologues, who volunteered eagerly to support National Socialist goals, to reluctant conscripts who served because refusal meant punishment. Most fell somewhere in between, young, women who had been shaped by a society that had normalized militarism and obedience, who had accepted service as unremarkable, and who had not questioned the larger purposes their work served until circumstances forced such questioning. What remains documented is the material reality of their experience in American captivity. The women captured at Grainau and processed through facilities like Garmisch and Augsburg received treatment that conformed to Geneva Convention standards. They were adequately fed, housed, and provided medical care. They were not executed, raped, or tortured despite propaganda that had insisted such treatment was certain. The contrast between what they had been told to expect and what actually occurred was so stark that it became a defining experience, one that many carried for the rest of their lives as evidence of how thoroughly the regime had lied to them. The statistical record supports individual accounts. Of approximately 450,000 women who served in Wehrmacht auxiliary roles during the war, fewer than 1,000 died in combat or from direct enemy action. The majority survived, were captured or surrendered, and were eventually repatriated after denazification processing. Mortality among female auxiliaries was approximately 0.2%, compared to mortality rates exceeding 15% for Wehrmacht combat personnel. The disparity reflects both the non-combatant nature of auxiliary roles and the fact that Allied forces generally treated female prisoners according to international law rather than propaganda predictions. The American military's adherence to Geneva Convention standards for female prisoners was not universal or perfect. Individual instances of mistreatment occurred. Some women reported harassment or assault by American soldiers. Military police investigated such reports when they were filed, court-martialed perpetrators in some cases, though conviction rates were low and punishment often minimal. The system was imperfect, administered by human beings in chaotic circumstances. But the systematic policy was clear. Female prisoners were to be treated according to international law, and the bureaucratic machinery to enforce that policy functioned well enough that most women experienced captivity as boring, uncertain, and frustrating, rather than brutal or life-threatening. The story of German women auxiliaries who expected execution and received coffee instead is a small episode within the massive scope of World War II. It involved thousands of women out of hundreds of millions affected by the war. It occurred in the conflict's final weeks when the outcome was already decided. It produced no dramatic battles or historically significant decisions, yet it reveals something fundamental about the nature of totalitarian propaganda and the human cost of systematic deception. The regime had constructed an entire reality for its people, a narrative framework that explained the war, justified the sacrifices it demanded, and predicted what defeat would mean. That framework was maintained through control of information, through punishment of dissent, through repetition of simple messages that became unquestioned truth. The women who served in Wehrmacht auxiliary roles had been shaped by this system from adolescence. They had been educated in schools that taught National Socialist ideology. They had consumed media entirely controlled by Goebbels' propaganda ministry. They had lived in a society where questioning official narratives was dangerous and where conformity was rewarded. When American forces captured them and provided coffee instead of execution, the propaganda framework shattered against evidence that could not be denied or explained away. The coffee was real. The rations were substantial. The medical care was provided. The letters to family were forwarded. American soldiers were not the criminal degenerates described in propaganda. They were ordinary men, often younger than the women they were guarding, doing their jobs according to regulations, and mostly eager to go home now that the war was ending. This collision between propaganda and reality produced psychological effects that lasted decades. Women interviewed by historians in the 1970s and 80s, 30 or 40 years after the events, still described their capture and early imprisonment as a transformative experience. It was the moment they understood they had been lied to, systematically and comprehensively, about fundamental aspects of reality. If the regime had lied about American treatment of prisoners, what else had been false? The answer, as they discovered over time, was almost everything. The broader significance lies in what this episode reveals about the mechanics of totalitarian control. The Nazi regime maintained power partly through violence and coercion, certainly, but it also maintained power through shaping belief, through creating a shared reality that seemed self-evident to those living within it. The propaganda about Allied brutality served multiple purposes. It discouraged surrender, it justified continued resistance when the war was clearly lost, and it bound people to the regime through shared fear of what defeat would bring. When individual Germans encountered evidence that contradicted this constructed reality, the psychological impact was severe. Some rejected the evidence, clinging to propaganda even when surrounded by contradictory facts. Others experienced what amounted to psychological collapse, a wholesale destruction of their conceptual framework for understanding the world. Most fell somewhere in between, gradually processing the truth while struggling to reconcile it with years of indoctrination. For the women from Grainau, who sat in American trucks that April morning expecting to die, the truth came in the form of bureaucratic prisoner processing, adequate rations, and real coffee. These mundane realities proved more powerful than any propaganda, precisely because they were real and present and undeniable. You could not dismiss the taste of real coffee as Allied propaganda. You could not explain away regular meals as a trick when they continued day after day. You could not maintain that Americans were barbaric criminals when they were filling out forms in triplicate and complying with Geneva Convention requirements. The regime had promised that National Socialist will and fighting spirit would overcome material disadvantages. It had insisted that racial superiority compensated for numerical and industrial inferiority. It had claimed that the cause was just and victory was certain, or at least possible if everyone remained loyal and committed. All of these promises were lies, but they were lies that millions had believed because the system gave them no access to contradictory information and punished doubt as defeatism or treason. The coffee was evidence, material and undeniable, that the system had been built on falsehood. American forces could provide real coffee to prisoners because American industrial capacity was so vast that luxury items could be distributed casually even to enemy personnel. The regime that had demanded total sacrifice from its people had been fighting an enemy with resources so abundant that they used them carelessly, feeding prisoners better than Germany fed its own soldiers. This was the final cost of the lies, the recognition that everything had been pointless because everything had been based on false premises. The women who had served in auxiliary roles had contributed their labor and accepted hardship and risked their lives for a regime that had lied to them about the enemy, about the war, about their chances, about what defeat would mean. When they discovered the truth, sitting in prisoner of war camps, drinking real coffee, and waiting for repatriation to a destroyed country, the knowledge was bitter beyond measure. Some carried that bitterness for the rest of their lives. Others found ways to move forward, to build new lives in post-war Germany, to raise families and pursue careers, and participate in rebuilding a society that had been shattered by the war the regime had started and lost. But all of them carried the memory of that moment when expectation collided with reality, when terror gave way to confusion and then understanding, when they learned that they had been deceived so thoroughly that they had nearly killed themselves to avoid a fate that was never going to occur. The lesson, if there is one, is about the power and danger of propaganda that constructs entire realities. The Nazi regime was not unique in using propaganda, but it was perhaps uniquely comprehensive in controlling information and punishing dissent. It created a closed system where official narratives could not be challenged, where contradictory evidence was suppressed, where people were shaped from childhood to accept certain truths without question. When that system collapsed, when people encountered reality that contradicted years of indoctrination, the psychological impact was devastating. The women from Grainau survived the war. They survived American captivity. They returned to a Germany divided and occupied, where the regime that had shaped their lives was being systematically dismantled and condemned. They lived through denazification, through rebuilding, through the long Cold War division of their country. Most lived into old age, carrying memories of a world that no longer existed and a moment when everything they had believed proved false. That moment, when American soldiers brought coffee instead of execution, remained vivid decades later because it was the moment of truth. Everything after flowed from that realization: the reconstruction of belief, the processing of guilt and responsibility, the attempt to understand how they had been deceived and why they had believed. The coffee was just coffee, a hot beverage distributed to prisoners of war according to regulations. But it was also evidence, undeniable and material, that they had been lied to about everything that mattered. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.